Welcome to the Behind the Mic podcast. And now, here's your host, Jordan Smith.
Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Mic, a sports media podcast. Today is episode number 4. We're going to take a little dive into the world of sports writing, sports blogging, whichever you prefer to call it. What it is, just in general, what it consists of, how you could get started, how I got started, my own personal story with the career, so on and so forth. Just learning about the sports writing world in general. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever it is you're listening. Of course, the main platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube Music. But also, it's pretty much anywhere you listen to. You got CastBox, Amazon Music, Audible, everywhere else you could think of. It's probably on there. So if you haven't done so yet, subscribe to the podcast and make sure you download each and every episode so that way you don't miss out on any of the great content here on Behind the Mic. Also, don't forget, we have our Q&A and poll questions available if you're listening on the Spotify mobile app that you can interact with as well. So be sure to leave your answers in the Q&A and answer the poll for us. They're only open for a week, and then they close the day before the next episode releases. So be sure you get in there, you make your votes, you fill out the Q&A, and also, if you want, leave a review. We appreciate you listening. So, the world of sports writing. What is it? It's actually pretty self-explanatory when you think about it. You're writing about sports. That's the podcast. No, I'm kidding. No, basically, sports writing is using a medium, whether it be the internet, something digital, or something physical, like a newspaper, like a book, whatever, a piece of paper even, and just writing about what's happening in sports. Sounds pretty easy. It is pretty easy. There's a lot of different ways you could go about sports writing. There's a lot of different roles. You've got team-specific, sports-specific, general sports writing, sports news. There's a ton. Sports betting now, fantasy sports, sports business, front office happening, so on and so forth. There's a ton of different roles in sports writing. And of course, when we talk about the different sports that you can write and analyze and discuss, there's a ton of them. Of course, you got the major ones: football, baseball, basketball. Then you got soccer, hockey. You got the pro level. You got the college level. You've got lacrosse. You've got tennis. You've got golf. You've got racing like NASCAR, Indy Series. You've got a ton of stuff, right? So there's not just one little area, one little section that is encompassing of all the sports. There's multiple different avenues, multiple different sports, multiple different topics, teams, cities, regions, players, executives, whatever. There's a lot to cover in the sports writing world. Now, when I say all that, you might then get a little intimidated. For those of you who are thinking about maybe wanting to do sports writing, have your own sports blog, that may sound a little intimidating just because of how much there is to cover. If you want to do general sports and cover everything, then okay, kind of pick a few topics that you can cover pretty consistently, pretty easily, but then still have a little bit of the other topics as well, right? But when you take a look at how things have evolved over the last 20 years of the internet, right? With how much it is a immediacy world when it comes to online news, social media, things like that, of get the news out first, right? There's kind of a thing that's been going around is whether or not in the sports world, in the writing world that is, whether you want to get the news out first or you be the one that gets the news right. And sometimes that can coincide, but there is a good amount of times where getting the story out first doesn't necessarily mean the story is correct. And when you look at that space, you look at that argument, you look at that space, that really kind of determines how you're going to really cover, if you want to be a sports writer, for example, how you cover and how you take care of a beat and things like that. Of course, a beat is your assignment. Whether, let's say, for example, if you're here in Houston, you have a Houston Texans beat. That means that you specifically cover anything going on with the Houston Texans. If you are a women's sports beat, anything to do with women's sports, the NWSL, the WNBA, Olympics, World Cup, anything, right? Fast pitch softball, anything and everything women's sports, right? So there's different beats, which is basically just your assignment, your specification for what you're covering. And of course, over the last 20 years, with everybody using social media and opinions becoming more and more of a shared commodity and also more and more of a diverse talking point, if you will, everybody's got something to say when it comes to sports. And part of that is you've seen the rise of blogs, websites, so on and so forth for people who are either professionals in the business or just freelancing and writing for a website that already exists, or they're creating their own website. I know that, and we'll talk about this in here in a little bit about how I did that. I've had my fair share of writing for other freelance opportunities, having my own website, so on and so forth. But we'll get to all of that here in a little bit. But talking about the amount, it's actually not as crowded as you think. It works a lot like podcasting, where a good majority of people in podcasting don't make it past a third episode. This is episode number 4. So this is basically a milestone here. So if you're listening to this point, put into the comments wherever you're listening, congratulations. That lets me know that you've made it to this point. But again, a lot of people don't even make it past the third episode of podcasting. There's even less percent. I think I want to say it's maybe the top 3% are the only podcast in the world who even get past probably the 12th episode. I think it's from what I saw in recent studies about a day or so ago while doing my own research. It works kind of the same way when you look at sports blogs. I don't have the numbers immediately in front of me, but based on my own experience and based on what I've seen from other people, so on and so forth, it works the same way. You can write a couple stories, sure. You could probably write a third. After that, there's going to be a lot of people who trail off. There's going to be a lot of people who make that first thing of, hey, welcome to my blog, welcome to the website, here's what to expect, so on and so forth, yada, yada, yada. And then a second post never comes out. And that's the end of that website. That's the end of that blog. That happens all the time. You have that welcome post, and then let's say you then write a couple stories. You write 2, you write 3, and then things just kind of fizzle out, whether you get busy with work or something happens in your life, what have you. There's a lot of those too. Then there's some people who will have consistent content and we'll get to that, 10th post mark, maybe the 11th, and then things will start to slow down again. And you see it a lot, especially with people who are in college or people who are young and trying to get something going. They want to see immediate results. Immediate results don't come. They get frustrated and they decide it's not worth it anymore and they stop, right? So as you post more and more and more, you're going to get into a territory where there's less and less and less people, the more you post, that have the same amount of content as you or the same content in general, right? Because anybody can pick up, grab a keyboard, turn on a computer, open a laptop, grab a pen, paper, whatever, and start writing about sports. But doing it consistently and researching the topic and everything else, that takes time, that takes effort, and sometimes you just don't see that many people get past a certain point to be able to continue. So when obviously you look at all the different options of the amount of blogs that there are, what have you, and think this is overwhelming, this is very crowded, how am I going to stand out? I can promise you it's not as crowded as you think. So with that, let's talk about how I got started with sports writing. It's actually what started my career in sports media. This was before I had ever thought about applying to Baylor University, which is the first university that I attended after attending Lone Star Community College for a couple of years. While I was at Lone Star, I started my own sports blog for about a year and a half. I had it called Houston Sports Beat, and I covered all the different, or at least as much as I could and was able to, of the different Houston sports teams. I had it for about a year before I was then accepted to Baylor University. And when I was accepted to Baylor, I applied to the job, or to a sports writer job at the school newspaper, the Baylor Lariat. If you remember me talking about how I got my start in play-by-play, that was in episode 2 of the podcast. So be sure to go back if you haven't done so yet and listen to that one as well. And again, rate, comment, subscribe, everything like that. But I talked about how I got my start at the Lariat as a sports writer and then eventually a broadcaster. And then as the rest of the podcast episode and episode 2 goes, the rest is history. But I got the job as a sports writer at the Lariat because of a story that I had already written on my sports blog before I applied to the sports reporter position at the Baylor Lariat. They wanted me to come to Waco and meet up with them at a writing convention. I was not able to attend due to some prior other engagements with work, school, so on and so forth. And so they said, okay, instead, how about you write a story about the recent dismissal of Art Briles, just to give you a timeline of when all this was happening. A story about the recently dismissed Art Briles due to all the Pepper Hamilton investigation being released and everything else. Luckily, like I said, I had already written a story on my own sports blog along with a catalog of all these other stories that at that point was about a year old of a blog through multiple different Houston area sports and then Baylor as well, that I had just recently started at that point about 2 or 3 months because I had gotten accepted to Baylor. And so with that, I already had the story ready to go. I emailed immediately and said, actually, I already have a story. Put it on my blog. Here you go. And the next email I got was, congratulations, you're hired. Sometimes it's that easy. Just starting up and doing it on your own can lead to opportunities down the road. Now, just because you have a sports blog does not mean that you're immediately going to get a job. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. But in regards to how you can get started and how you can continue success, do well, so on and so forth. But to just explain a little bit more of what I've done in my career when it comes to sports writing in that area, I had the blog when I got to Baylor. I started being a sports writer in my first semester at Baylor University. In my second semester, I was promoted to become the sports editor at the Baylor Lariat. And then after that, I left Baylor. I transferred to Sam Houston. I used the experience I had as both a writer and an editor to become a sports writer, started back towards the bottom and worked my way back up at the Houstonian, the student newspaper of Sam Houston State University. Worked my way back up, started as a sports reporter when I transferred in the spring of 2018 and worked my way back up, became a sports editor that second semester, and then got to do a whole bunch of various different things at the newspaper while occasionally still doing sports as well, and then still doing my broadcasting on the side. It led to freelance opportunities through other websites, through other sports websites. It led to freelance opportunities in the city of Huntsville with the city newspaper, the Huntsville Item. And it just created a bunch of opportunities for me to be able to use in my career. And now you can see a little bit of some of the tools, trades, and everything I learned on my blog, on my website. My website's down in the description, so if you have not visited yet, go check it out. I've got some content that is on there for you to read and check out. That's not just about the podcast, but other things as well in my career and in sports, which is also, some of those posts are put behind a Patreon. So if you haven't checked it out yet, go check out my Patreon and subscribe so you can get Patreon member access. I almost said user. Patreon member access to those certain career and sports topic blog posts I have as well, just to see some of my work. But anyways, we're getting off track here. The point is, if I had not started that sports blog in, I guess, what would that have been? I guess that would have been spring of 2015. If I had not started the sports blog then, I would not have gotten the job probably at the Baylor Lariat. I don't want to say as easy as I got it, because it almost seemed too easy, but having that history of writing and having that history of everything, plus already having written that story, so on and so forth, and the skills that I learned while writing and everything before I even got to the Lariat helped me get the job, because I had the history of continuously putting out content, so on and so forth. So I guess we can go ahead. It's, again, a little shorter episode today, but that's okay. With that, let's go ahead and get into how you can get started. There's a lot of different ways. Like we mentioned, the internet is humongous. It is not just a sea to shining sea thing. It is a whole global internet. It is something that gives you plenty of opportunity to get your career started and to be able to get into sports writing and share your opinions with everyone with ease. But there's multiple ways of doing it. Like I mentioned earlier, I have content on my own website that is sitting behind a Patreon paywall. Now, you could do that. You could also have a Patreon and just put the stories directly on the Patreon page. So that way, not only are you putting out content, you also get paid for it by having people who subscribe to your Patreon be the only ones that can see said content. So it helps on a financial side as well. There's also other ways you could do it. You could join a sports blog, whether that be joining one that already exists, which there are plenty, and I mean plenty, of websites that would absolutely be willing and pretty much are 24/7, 365, looking for people who want to freelance and who want to write stories about sports, teams, players, whatever the case may be on their networks. Or you can do like what some of us have done and create your own website for sports blogging. You know, of course, that takes a little bit of web design experience, and that's something that we might get into later on in future podcast episodes, but there's multiple ways of doing this, right? And those are just some of the ways that I've explained it. If you're not someone who's looking to create your own website, but you want to just start getting some bylines, the easiest way to do it, to kind of start building that, I don't want to say reputation, but I guess building that experience with consistent content, with building the experience of writing stories, and then eventually building a community based off of it, is by joining some kind of a blog network that already exists. Like I said, there are plenty of them that exist that you can go join. All you got to do is just look up freelance sports blogger, freelance sports writer, and there will be plenty of those opportunities available. Now, I need to go into this and tell you there's a caveat. These aren't going to be high-paying jobs. Most of this career isn't, and that's okay. But if you're going to start freelancing, don't expect put out a story and you get $100 off of it immediately. No. It's going to take time, it's going to take resources, and it's going to take a little bit of patience on your end to get to where you want to be. Now, if you're trying to do it for a financial reason, don't do it. It's going to take way too long. You're not going to see results immediately, and you would be better off doing something else. But, like most of this career, if you're doing it for the love of sports, for the love of the team, whatever the case may be, you're just trying to get started in the career, so on and so forth, then this is the perfect way to do it, is by either joining a network that already exists or creating your own brand and just consistently putting out content. As long as you are consistent with your writing in regards to how much you're putting out, what teams you're putting it out about, so on and so forth, people will find your content. Again, it's not going to happen right away unless you have a overnight sensation story for your first blog post, which is absolutely rare. You probably have a better chance of winning the lottery than doing that. But, and that's not me saying go and get a lottery ticket. That is not financial advice. I just want to put that out there. But have patience with it, because you never know what could happen, who you meet, who you could get some advice from, what connections you could build based off of the sports blogs, so on and so forth. You just never know. But if you never start, then obviously you're never going to be able to get into said business. So yes, it's nerve-wracking. Yes, it's terrifying. It can be stressful to especially try to stay consistent, meeting your own deadlines, everything like that. And that's understandable. It was for me too. I have had plenty of startups and fail downs. I try to make a pun there, didn't work. I've had plenty of ones that I've started and plenty of them that have failed. But it was the one blog that I decided to keep at it and keep consistent with that allowed me to eventually get a job at a school newspaper that would be the catalyst to my entire career. All it takes is just staying consistent with the one thing that you got going, and eventually it could open up doors for the entire rest of your career. Like I said, a little bit shorter episode today, but that will do it for this week's edition of Behind the Mic, a sports media podcast. Don't forget, we have the Patreon. Pretty soon here, starting in the month of August, we're going to start releasing video versions of this podcast alongside the audio versions that you can get everywhere on any platform, the one you're listening to now or any other platform that you listen to your podcast. But starting in August, we're going to release video forms of this podcast, and they will be behind the Patreon paywall. So it would probably be best for you to go ahead and subscribe so you can start getting the other content you get as well with it. Stories about career, sports stories, behind the scenes once a month, videos on game prep and everything else going on in my career, as well as the video form of the blog or the podcast, and a whole lot more. Like I said, also don't forget to subscribe and review the podcast as well. Let us know how you like it. Let us know what you think about the podcast, and in the Q&A as well, let us know what things you like about the podcast, what things you don't like, what you'd like to see potentially change, what you would like to see talked about maybe in a future episode, so on and so forth. Of course, all the social media links are in the description of this episode, so make sure you go follow us on every single one of those, because we will always have a preview of what that week's episode is. Plus, we will have the links for you when we do upload each episode, and we will also have some interesting little tidbits every single week about different things within sports media, different facts you may not have known, so on and so forth, different profiles of other people in the sports media industry, so on and so forth. Coming up next week, I believe we're going to have another guest on the show. I'm waiting to confirm it, so again, I'm not going to say it like the last guest, but I believe we will have another guest on next week's episode of Behind the Mic, so be sure you stay tuned for that, and I will have that information out to you as soon as possible. But again, that does it for another edition of Behind the Mic. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week. So long, folks.
for listening to the Behind the Mic podcast. Listen to every episode of Behind the Mic on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Open any of these apps and search Behind the Mic. Then hit the follow button so you won't miss a single episode.